Everybody take a deep breath because today we are finishing the book. Roll tape. Hooligans, and welcome back for some more Shelton Shenanigans. We are here to read the in-between sections. So, let's get to it. These in-between sections are just going to go over some additional information to kind of help us understand all the things we've already read since we've already finished the book. We're already done with the book. But we're just going to build our background knowledge so that if the American Revolution comes up later on in school, then we will have awesome prior knowledge thanks to this book. So the first section is, this is going to be a super short video too. So the first section is on prisoners of the British. So it says, during the war, at least 16 British hulks are ships that have been damaged and abandoned, lay in the waters off the shores of New York City as floating prisoners. So this means they're obviously not real prisoners. This is kind of like that personification that we talked about when we were discussing figurative language. It's talking about the boat as floating prisoners. Over 10,000 prisoners. Now, they do have boats, or they do have people on there. So those are prisoners of war. Over 10,000 prisoners died of intentional neglect, starvation, and untreated disease. Their bodies were tossed overboard into the harbor or buried in shallow graves at the shoreline by fellow prisoners. So it's saying that all of these people that were left on these ships, they left them there to die, like on purpose. And so then they would just die of starvation. So they would just get so hungry and so dehydrated, or they would die of untreated disease. So not fun at all. So that was the first section. See, that's super easy. Moving right along. Okay. This next section is on the treatment of prisoners of war. So this is how they were treated. So obviously we know if they're prisoners of war, they're probably not treated that great. It says prisoners were only given 1 cup of water a day below decks. The rations issued only in the mornings, and only half of those received by British soldiers were largely inedible, which means they couldn't even be eaten. Leftover food from England that was old, stale, and in many cases rotten. So that's all that they were given, was old, stale, rotten food. It was not until the 19th century that supplies for captives were expected to be provided by their captors. During the Revolutionary War, their own army, government, and families attempted to provide for prisoners. So, next section, see? Check. Moving right along. Okay. This section is on British behavior. The British, on their military tear through the countryside as they tried to regain control of the wayward colonists, adopted what became later known as fire and sword, as the fire and sword strategy rather than a hearts and minds policy. That is, rather than attempting to persuade the rebels, they destroyed towns and warehouses. They sacked and burned plantations, crops, and livestock. They plundered and stole from households and stores alike without regard to law or justice or the well-being of the people that they encountered. So basically, instead of trying to convince the people that were going against the king, like, hey, that's not right, you should be supporting the king because of these reasons right here, instead of trying to go about it calmly and civilizedly, anyways, they just came in and destroyed everything like we heard about all throughout this book. So that is the British behavior. So the last thing I'm going to read, this is the afterword. So an afterword is usually written by the author to kind of explain why he or she wrote this book. So it's super short, and I just thought y'all would find it interesting. So the afterword. Woods runner. is not an attempt to write the history of war for independence. Rather, this book, along with being the story of Samuel and his parents and their part in the war, is meant to clarify some aspects of that conflict that have been often brushed over. So instead of trying to rewrite history and tell you a different thing, the author knows, Gary Paulson knows that most of us know the background on the story. He just wanted to tell the specific story of Samuel and his parents because a lot of the different details that we read about in this book are details that are usually brushed over or not told in regular history books. Some of the dreadful nuts and bolts of battle, the real and horrible truths, are frequently overlooked because other parts are more dramatic and appealing to the audience. There's a tendency to clean up the tales of war to make them more tellable, focusing on the rousing stories of heroism and stirring examples of patriotism, all clean, pristine, and antiseptic. But the simple fact is that all combat is outrageous. So like all war, all fighting. Thousands and thousands of young soldiers die horrible, painful deaths, lying in their own filth, alone and far from home, weak and hallucinating, forgotten and lost. The Revolutionary War lasted for 8 long, slaughtering years. Over 200,000 men between the ages of 16 and 25 answered the call in the War for Independence and stood to. So over 200,000 men between the ages of 16 to 25 went to fight in the war. So imagine someone in your life that you know that is between the ages of 16 to 25. 200,000. Do you think that they would be ready to go off to war? Because 200,000 men went off to war. And it says they answered the call in the War for Independence and stood to. Stood to when that often meant death. So even though they knew that they were probably going to go off and never be able to come back because they would probably die fighting for their country, they still chose to do so. Approximately 4,400 young men were killed in combat by a musket ball, exploding artillery, grape shot from a cannon, or a steel bayonet shoved through their bodies. Disease accounts for another 30 to 50,000 losses. Although it is difficult to determine accurately the number of wounded men who subsequently died of infection, estimates put the figure between 50 and 30,000. Open wounds were bathed with dirty sponges, kept in pails of filthy, bloody water. Surgeons went days between washing their hands or instruments because of the lack of resources. Most of the wounded, seething in dirt, bacteria, and infection, were sent home to die months later, well past any documented casualty roll. So even if they were sick and got sent home and then they died at home, they weren't counted in that 30 to 50,000 because they were technically at home when they died. But still they died as a result of the war. The total figure might be on the order of 60,000 deaths. Although accurate records of the wounded never existed, the figure is generally thought to be about 4 wounded for every man who died on the battlefield or died of disease in the camps. Back then, however, most of the wounded did not live, and so the proportion was more likely 2 wounded for every man killed. That puts the total casualty figure conservatively at a staggering 100,000 to 110,000. Out of just over 200,000 men who fought, over half of them died. In the eastern colonies, whole towns were left without these young men. They sent their sons and fathers and husbands off, never to see them again, not even to be able to bury them. The men fighting and dying in the War for Independence were, for the most part, average young working men with little or no military training. They were fighting the most powerful nation on earth, and they suffered those horrendous casualty rates for an appalling 8 years. That these young men and boys stood, too, as they did, in the face of withering odds, and actually won and created a country that we know today with their blood, sweat, and tears is nothing short of astonishing. So, that is the book. We are officially done. So, I hope y'all super duper love the book. This was such an awesome book. We have now read 2 novels by Gary Paulsen. So if y'all have any recommendations for other books, I know that on another video y'all left me some recommendations, so I definitely took those into consideration. But if anybody else has any other considerations, or any other requests, I mean, you are more than welcome to comment below. If you're unable to comment below because you're on a school account, you can always email me or message me through any of the social medias that appear at the end of the video. And that goes for even if you don't have any suggestions for Gary Paulsen books. If you just have any other suggestions for books that you want me to read, period, that you know that you've seen in my classroom library, or maybe that you've seen here, or if you just really want me to go find a book, I can try and go find it at Barnes & Noble or wherever I can find books. So I hope that this book has made your quarantine a little bit more manageable, and I cannot wait to hear all of your fun requests and keep chatting with y'all through the summer. Like I said in my other video, I would love for y'all to keep watching these videos. I'm going to keep uploading them throughout the summer. I'm going to try and stay as consistent as I can with doing them. Obviously, I'm going to keep posting them as long as y'all are watching them. So the more views they get, the more that I will post. And it's an awesome way for us to be able to still be able to, it's an awesome way for us to still be able to keep in touch, even though the summer months are going to be kind of long. And I know we all love summer, but I also really miss you guys. So I hope that we can keep up with each other through this platform of YouTube. We also obviously have all of the other social medias that are about to pop up at the end. Be sure you go like, follow, subscribe, whatever you need to do to all of those social medias as well, so that we can definitely keep in touch over these summer months. I miss you guys. I love you guys. Now go change the world.